The March of the Remembered, a Cliff Notes story about the First World War. Originally adapted from an article written by John Spring in September 2001. The Northern Valley is best known for its Revolutionary War history, but we played an important role in other events which receive less attention. This video highlights local contributions in the year 1918, right in the middle of the Great War, the war to end all wars, or what we now know as World War I. These soldiers marched from Camp Merritt, a massive embarkation camp built in 1917 at the Cresskill-Dumont border, touching the towns of Demorest, Haworth, Bergenfield, and Tenafly. It encompassed 770 acres and was crafted for the shipment of troops from the port of Hoboken. The men arrived after months of training at older camps scattered throughout the country. Here, they mingled, realizing for the first time how diverse America truly was. Soldiers would march through rural towns on their way east from the camp. From there, they would descend Old Closter Dock Road and enter the Palisades Interstate Park, a recreation area established for almost 20 years. At the foot of the Palisades Cliffs, they reached a colonial structure, the historic Kearney House, and would walk past onto ferries bound for Hoboken. Downriver, seafaring boats waited to take them across the Atlantic to join the fight. Hundreds of thousands of troops would march their way through the Palisades Interstate Park before the war's conclusion. Towns throughout the Northern Valley went all out to make the soldiers' last days on home soil as comfortable as possible. The camp's facilities were the newest in the entire country. Local residents opened up their homes to the families of soldiers who wanted to say their last goodbyes. Their sons would soon be overseas, joining the fight. One spry Cresskill resident, Miss Gladys Pendergast, called Muffy by friends, recalled how she and her siblings doubled up in beds so her parents could take in families from all over the United States. During that time, Muffy would fill a water bucket and provide a drinking spoon for troops marching past her home. Mrs. Stell Tallman, in a house just west of Cresskill Station, put lawn chairs on her porch for visitors to rest on when all her rooms were full. An heiress from Alpine, named Alberta K. Miles, would host officers at tea parties and luncheons, trying to find a romantic match for her servant Ella. After the war, an officer would return from Europe and marry Ella. The ceremony was in the same house they shared their first meal. Not all of the soldiers who marched from the camp to the ferry went willingly. Some were what we now call casual troops. These were men who showed up in the camp without papers, having been in a hospital or gone AWOL, some deciding to visit home for Christmas while it was still possible. Officers had their hands full handling such men. They finally formed them into companies and shipped them overseas. There, if the soldiers went AWOL, they could be charged with desertion. One soldier who guarded the stockade reported he was conducting a group of such men to the ferry at night. One of the casual troops broke away as they were marching down the road to the ferry. A guard fired his gun, and the next day they found the runaway's body in the woods along the Palisades. Not all the troops leaving camp for Europe went to Hoboken by ferry. Many went on the West Shore Railroad from Dumont, or on the Erie trains through Tenafly and Englewood. That route was also used for a more gruesome cargo. In Tenafly, people remembered seeing trains moving slowly by, stacked with coffins. Instead of glory on the front, these men and their nurses were falling at Camp Merritt from an invisible enemy. As summer turned to autumn in 1918, doctors faced a strain of influenza they could not stop. Men and women in their prime would sicken and die in a day, their lungs saturated and heavy, By the middle of September, the best doctors knew only that, in each camp or locality, the epidemic would reach its peak in about 3 weeks, and then subside. They begged the military to delay troop shipments until that peak passed. The officers, under constant pressure to get troops to the front in Europe, ignored them. Those at Camp Merritt tried their best to stop contagion, wearing cloth masks and keeping their environment clean. A man named Sam Ridley, part of Closter's black community, was employed as a janitor during the camp's existence. But nurses and other support staff could only do so much. On the night of September 27, 1918, troops from Camp Merritt began to march to the Alpine Ferry. As they marched, some began to fall by the wayside, feverish with the flu. Ambulances and trucks took some of them back to the camp. Volunteers helped others get back. Even more infected soldiers boarded the ferry for Hoboken, where doctors tried to weed them out before they boarded for shipment overseas. The men would be crossing the Atlantic in the world's largest ship, the Leviathan. Because of its size, the Leviathan had extra capacity added so it could take in more men. A contingent of nurses was aboard as well, but the nurses could not climb to the top of the 4-tiered bunks, and the sick men on top could not climb down. Men who lost their dog tags were buried at sea, in spite of a policy that all soldiers were to be returned to the States for burial. The loss of life on the voyage could only be estimated at 90, but around 2,000 people in total aboard the Leviathan became ill. Shortly after this episode, doctors placed Camp Merritt under a quarantine, which lasted until the November armistice ended the war. 578 people lost their lives at the camp in total: soldiers, nurses, and 1 civilian employee. After such a tragedy and the war's conclusion, the camp was disassembled. Men like Sam Ridley found work elsewhere, and soldiers no longer marched down the Palisades. Soldiers began trickling back after the end of the war, many visiting through the Palisades, just as they had on their way to Europe. Catherine Lamb Tate, an artist who lived along the cliff tops, designed a plaque to commemorate what had happened here. On Memorial Day in 1924, the large obelisk, which still stands today, was dedicated in a ceremony by 20,000 people. The monument itself was designed by Robert Atkin, designer of countless monuments at West Point and creator of the Supreme Court's West Pediment. General John Pershing, who was the commander of our troops in Europe during the war, was the main speaker. Other important guests included the governor of New Jersey and the widow of Major General Merritt, the famed Civil War cavalryman and namesake of the camp. As many as 1 million men were shipped through Camp Merritt, and it was one of the largest World War I embarkation camps in the country. Today, those who lost their lives during the 1918 flu epidemic are still remembered every time people of the Northern Valley drive under the shadow of this monument or trace their steps along the Palisades.